archaeologists uncovered an extensive cemetery containing the earliest gold treasure in the world, dating back 6,500 years to 4500 BC. These graves contained more than 3,000 gold artifacts, weighing over 6 kilograms. Such a concentration of gold objects has not been recorded anywhere else in the 5th millennium BC. In fact, the weight and number of gold finds here exceeds by several times the combined weight and number of all gold artifacts in all excavated sites of the same millennium, that's 5000 to 4000 BC, from all over the world, including Mesopotamia and Egypt. This discovery was completely unprecedented. Instead of the glorious civilizations of the Near East, the first great goldsmiths on earth lived here, on the shores of the Black Sea. As well as the stunning quantities of gold, the people of this society buried its wealthy leaders with fine weapons and other magnificent ornaments. So who were these people? How did they accumulate so much wealth? And what happened to them? This is the story of the Varna culture. The cemetery was situated about 400 metres north of Lake Varna. The burial ground occupied a terrace that sloped gently southward towards the water's edge, at an elevation of 12 to 18 metres above modern sea level. The cemetery was created about 4500 BC by a society known today as the Varna culture, which was named after this site. Excavations were conducted at Varna between 1972 and 1991 and exposed a large area containing over 300 graves. Unfortunately, most of the human bones were poorly preserved due to high soil acidity, but still the graves were absolutely incredible. They revealed a technological and artistic sophistication thousands of years ahead of its time. The nature of the graves suggested this was a highly stratified society, showing a lower class with few goods and an upper class with fantastic grave goods, and above them all were just a handful of extraordinarily rich graves of the powerful chiefs. These kinds of societies were unprecedented this early on. Spectacular wealth like this only usually came from mature, complex civilizations, like the burials in the royal cemetery of Ur 2000 years later. And the individuals buried at Varna with their battle axes and sex-differentiated positions look, to me, more like burials of the later Indo-European societies of Europe, like those of the corded ware or the Bell-Beaker cultures. Unlike the kurgan or burial mound tradition that would later sweep across Europe, there were no surface monuments, mounds or markers preserved over the Varna graves. The grave pits themselves were rectangular with rounded corners. The graves can be divided into two main groups, those containing human remains and those without, what they call cenotaphs. That seems strange. If there's no body, then how can it be a grave? Well, we'll come back to that in a minute. The bottom of the grave pit of each cenotaph was covered with some kind of organic matter, fur, fabric or matting, decorated with red pigment. Similar floor deposits were also found in the very rich graves with bodies. This is interesting to me because laying bodies on matting, along with the use of red pigment, makes me think of the Yamnaya burial tradition from the Pontic steppe. Using ochre in burials is also seen in broadly contemporary 5th millennium BC cultures in the steppe river valleys, like the Dnieper-Donetsk culture, the Sredny Stog, Gvalinsk and the Samara cultures. However, using red ochre in burials is probably the oldest and most widespread burial tradition in the world, so there's not necessarily any direct link to be found here. All but 5 of the 310 graves contained grave goods. The most common are ceramic vessels, which almost every grave had. And although this was a metalworking society, they still used and valued more ancient materials. Flint tools or weapons were in 140 graves. Bone or antler tools and implements occurred in 76 graves. Polished stone axes, chisels, adzes or polishers were found in 58. And copper tools and weapons were in just 78 of the graves, demonstrating that metal was not necessarily meant for everyone. However, more than 80% of the graves had artifacts made from imported materials. Gold, copper, various minerals, and spondylus and dentalium shells from the Aegean. This was not an isolated society. These leaders used their power to bring in what they needed and valued from elsewhere. Tools and weapons were found around the upper body and head or beside the arms. Ornaments were placed on those parts of the body where they would have been worn by the deceased during his or her life. Bracelets on the arms, rings on the fingers, earrings beside the head, and so on. So people surely went into the graves wearing their finery and holding their tools and weapons. Social divisions are also demonstrated by the bodies themselves. The bodies were either in an extended position on their backs or in a contracted position on their sides. 74% of the extended bodies were male and 26 were female, and were usually provided with a battle axe or a small clay vessel. The famous Grave 43, with its 1.5 kilograms of gold, is one of these extended burials. These amazing grave goods included ritual attire ornamented with gold appliques, gold and carnelian beads, a hat decorated with gold lamulae, earrings, a necklace and bracelets made from gold rings, spondylus shell bracelets, spears with copper and flint points, a bow and a quiver lined with gold, stone and copper axes, and a scepter, which was a stone axe whose shaft was lined with gold. I've seen various estimates of his age, but he was likely in his 40s or 50s when he died. The astonishing abundance of his grave goods surely reflects his position as the ruler of his people. The contracted burials mostly lay on their right side and generally contained fewer grave goods, and metal artifacts were rare. But these graves also tended to have various elements of dress and ornaments, including necklaces made from beads of different materials, gold, minerals and shells, amulets, bracelets and appliques. 54% of the contracted burials were female and 46% were male. Although with both kinds of burials we have an incomplete picture because of the poor preservation of the remains, so the percentages just relate to those burials that could be sexed. And out of the 310 burials, there were 47 that contained no human remains. These are called cenotaphs, and graves of this kind are usually interpreted as symbolic graves of people who died while they were away from home. Maybe they went trading and never came back, or their boat sank while out fishing. You still had to have a burial even if there was no body, because the burial ritual was a vital part of the process in sending the soul of the deceased to the next world. But there are different kinds of cenotaphs here at Varna. There are three, very close to one another, that each contained life-size masks of human faces made from unbaked clay laid where the head would have been if there was a body. Gold objects mark some of the features of the face, a rectangular strip for the mouth and round dots for the eyes. And each of these three symbolic people wore ornaments: a gold tiara, tiny gold nails or studs piercing the lips, gold earrings on the ears, and a necklace with beads made from spondylus and Italium shells or minerals like carnelian, with gold pendants shaped as stylized female bodies. No battle axes or large copper artifacts were found in these three cenotaphs, although each yielded a copper pin, a flint knife and a spindle whorl, suggesting that the three graves were those of women. It has been proposed that rather than representing real women who died, these represent goddesses worshipped by the local population. And maybe that is what they are. I wonder also if these represent three women who were sent away to a foreign tribe for marriage, or maybe they were taken by raiders and this was their symbolic burial. The size of the graves and the location of the grave goods of the 44 other cenotaphs were the same as those of the graves with bodies, but none of the others had clay masks or human remains. This group of symbolic graves is quite diverse. Some contained few grave goods and no ornaments, while others contained an abundance of grave goods. Just 3 of them contained gold objects that together accounted for more than half of the total weight of all gold grave goods yielded by the cemetery, an enormous amount of treasure. A scepter, a symbol of political or religious authority, was discovered in each of these 3 graves. One interpretation of these 3 incredibly rich graves is that they are the symbolic burial of a chieftain or king who lost his position during life. They then ritually buried the symbols of his power, and a new chief took over. I don't know if I buy that personally, but I don't have a better interpretation. In fact, some have suggested, as a way to explain the incredible abundance here, that the Varna cemetery was a place of regional importance, a cult centre for the burial of the chiefs from the entire Balkan Peninsula. However, it's more likely that the cemetery was the burial site of the local community here on the shore of the Varna Bay, which turned into the present-day Lake Varna when the sea levels rose thousands of years ago, flooding the area. The local community, the centre of power where these people lived, is represented by 8 settlements that existed together in the Chalcolithic that are now to be found at the bottom of Lake Varna. These settlements were at least 350 metres by 80 metres in size, and they were about 2 to 3 kilometres apart, which is the highest density of settlements anywhere in the Balkans during this period. Of course, as they're deep underwater now, they're hard to excavate, but dredging the lake bottom brings up evidence that copper working was being carried out here. So how did this community come to be so rich and powerful? Who were they, and what happened to them? Now, these people did not live in a vacuum. They were part of a wider society, the Chalcolithic civilization of the Balkans, sometimes called Old Europe. Old Europe is a term coined by Lithuanian archaeologist Marija Gimbutas to describe the pre-Indo-European Neolithic and Copper Age civilization of southeastern Europe. Some may quibble over the use of the word civilization. Professor David Anthony says the following, quote, "In 4500 BC, before the first cities were built in Mesopotamia and Egypt, Old Europe was among the most sophisticated and technologically advanced places in the world. At its peak, about 5000 to 3500 BC, Old Europe was developing many of the political, technological and ideological signs of civilization. Old European metalsmiths were in their day among the most advanced metal artisans in the world. The demand for copper, gold, Aegean shells and other valuables created networks of negotiation that reached hundreds of kilometers. Pottery, figurines and even houses were decorated with striking designs. Female goddess figurines, found in almost every settlement, have triggered intense debates about the ritual and political power of women. Signs inscribed on clay suggest a system of primitive notation, if not writing." End quote. There are many archaeological cultures defined within the umbrella term Old Europe, representing societies in specific regions and in certain eras. And in the mid-5th millennium BC, the Varna culture emerged in the southern parts of the Dobruja region between the River Danube and the Black Sea coast. It emerged from earlier regional cultures that were already sophisticated in their art and technology. And the Varna people were closely related culturally to their contemporary neighbours. They lived in roughly the same way, growing crops and raising animals, making excellent pottery, smelting copper and trading goods. But something different happened to the people of the Varna culture. The rulers of this society were more sharply differentiated. They generated and accumulated great wealth and wore it upon their person. They went to their graves displaying the symbols of their masculine power, like their battle axes, and, in the most famous burial, a gold penis sheath. The gold was extracted from the rivers rising from the Balkan mountains, and from there exported to Varna, where it was smelted and made into artifacts. The copper was likewise imported from sources 120 to 200 kilometers away, before being worked in the Varna settlements. Likewise, the excellent flint they used was imported from 100 kilometers away, along with graphite they used for decorating pottery. There were over 1,000 spondylus shell ornaments, bracelets, beads and appliques, and more than 12,200 dentalium shells were also found. Both shell species came from the northern Aegean coast or the Aegean islands. Social stratification in the region emerged along with new economic developments, namely mining, metallurgy and the related increase in long-distance trade and exchange. The separation of crafts and trade from farming and agriculture provided conditions for the concentration of power in the hands of those willing and able to take it. The battle axes, long flint blades, spears and arrows seen in the burials suggest the means by which this was done. So it looks like we're seeing the emergence here of a proto-aristocracy, a social and political structure that Sir Colin Renfrew reckons was a chiefdom. However, the striking hierarchies seen in the graves don't seem to be reflected in the settlements. There aren't any new grand houses that are bigger than the others, and there are none containing special objects or layouts that others don't have. Archaeologists believe, therefore, that the emerging social stratification did not have a strong impact on everyday life. Rather, it was in funeral customs alone that these new hierarchies were expressed. But that seems unlikely to me. These chiefs may not have used their growing power to build bigger houses, but I'm sure they exercised their power in less material ways. Certainly they exerted enormous social influence over their own people and external allies and enemies. The most spectacular burial of all, the glorious Varna chieftain, was perhaps also a metal worker. Muscle marks on the skeleton show that the bones were exposed to great physical stress. He was a strong man, and the strong muscles of his lower arm specifically suggest he used it for continuous work. The bones also show arthritis in his neck, hands and feet. The left hip and especially the left knee were also affected. The condition of his left tibia also suggests a lifetime of sitting in a squatting position with one leg tucked underneath him. Perhaps not all the Varna chiefs were metal workers, and perhaps his day job was incidental to his leadership role. But it's surely no coincidence that a man who controlled the extraction and importing of copper and gold would also control the manufacturing process too. I would imagine that metalworking techniques were closely guarded secrets, passed down amongst a select few. They would surely have practiced ritual activities too, amongst themselves relating to their work, and perhaps also for their wider community. Imagine the power that these men wielded. They were warriors and chieftains with esoteric knowledge of a sacred craft, importing the most special materials in the world from distant lands. With the focus on masculine power and individual glory seen in single graves, the warrior kings clutching their battle axes, it all seems rather Indo-European, doesn't it? But of course, they're not an Indo-European people. Genetic testing of 5 of the individuals from the Varna cemetery shows that they were typical early European farmers, with some admixture from Western and Eastern European Mesolithic hunter-gatherers. Of the 4 males tested, their Y haplogroups are those associated with Neolithic farmers, rather than those of the Indo-European steppe herders that would later sweep across Europe. However, the 2018 study, The Genomic History of Southeastern Europe, led by Ian Matheson, also found some steppe admixture in these people. One young girl actually had quite a lot of what they called Yamnaya DNA. The reference population they used was Yamnaya from the Samara Valley. Now, the Yamnaya culture did not exist yet, but the ancestors of the Yamnaya did. And around 4500 BC, new long-distance exchange systems connected the Kovalence culture of the Samara Valley with the Varna-era Balkans. So along with the exchange of goods, it seems these societies were exchanging DNA, and no doubt they were exchanging ideas as well. The great chief himself also shows some steppe ancestry. The young girl with the most out of the 5 samples was about 5 or 6 years old and was buried in a crouched position on her right side. The grave is quite richly furnished with ceramic vessels and large amounts of jewellery made from spondylus shell and beads of various minerals. There's no indication she was anything other than a full member of this society, and the grave is typical of the earliest burials of the Varna culture. So the relationship with steppe societies, whatever that was, goes back to the start. They traded with the Kovalence culture of the Middle Volga region, but they were not the closest of the steppe populations. The Sredni Stog culture was emerging on the river Dnieper around the middle of the 5th millennium BC, and towards the end of the millennium, the Suvarovo culture emerged, who are known from their Kurgan burials. David Anthony believes this represents the chiefly elite within the Sredni Stog culture. This elite was involved in raiding and trading with the lower Danube in this period, just before the collapse of Old Europe. This collapse occurred during a climatic shift around 42 to 4100 BC, leading to colder winters and floods and erosion in the lower Danube Valley. David Anthony says, quote, "Between about 4200 and 3900 BC, more than 600 tell settlements of the Gulmanicha, Karanovo 6 and Varna cultures were burned and abandoned in the lower Danube Valley and eastern Bulgaria." He goes on, "It looks like the tell towns of old Europe fell to warfare, and somehow immigrants from the steppes were involved. But the primary causes of the crisis could have involved climate change and related agricultural failures, or soil erosion and environmental degradation accumulated from centuries of intense farming, or internecine warfare over declining timber and copper resources, or a combination of all of these." End quote. The beginning of the 4th millennium BC brought an end to a sophisticated society that had briefly achieved a level of political and aesthetic brilliance unrivaled elsewhere.